Hi, and welcome to the NGINX Community Chats. During our chat, you're going to have a chance to hear about some things open sourcey, meet some of the people inside and outside of NGINX and F5 working on open source, and maybe even learn something new. And today we have Mike Jang with us to talk about the bits and bytes of a project he's been working on. Thanks for joining us today, Mike. So what do you do here at NGINX?
I'm a principal technical writer here at NGINX. What that means is, in reality, is I have two tracks. Number one, I cover and write about new features related to NGINX. I see something new, people tell me about it. I get to try it out. I see it does. I think, oh my God, this stuff is fantastic. I get to write about it. Second track, I get to work on projects like this for the community where, as you've heard in a previous video, we're open sourcing our documentation repository.
That sounds really cool. But I also know you've got quite an interesting background in open source. Share some of the details with us.
Sure, sort of a previous career, I worked writing computer books. My agent told me once, hey, Mike, you ever hear of this thing called the Red Hat Certified Engineer Exam? I thought, what is that? My first Linux distribution was Red Hat 5.1. That was back in 99. I checked out the requirements for the Red Hat exam. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to need help with this. I was fortunate that the open source community was strong even then. I was able to rely on them for help, but they had reasonable requirements. They said, hey, Mike, if you want our help, you better contribute too. That's when I learned the functional meaning of open source.
Very, very cool. So, yeah, you mentioned in the introduction that this is an open source documentation project. Now, Nginx Open Source Core's documentation has always been open. So, what is this project really about?
It's about opening the rest of the documentation to the community to help people see, okay, we can try this stuff about Nginx as well. And eventually we'll be bringing the Nginx core documentation into the same repository so people can contribute to it all and see how it all works together.
You know, documentation is that unsung hero in open source projects, very honestly. And without good documentation, I don't, I've heard the phrase just read the source code, but 99% of the people can't read the source code. And if you really wanted to try to read the Nginx source code, it's fascinating, but I'm not sure it's going to necessarily help you. But you're open sourcing all of the documentations. What was it like trying to open source all this documentation? Because there are a lot of Nginx projects.
Yep, I mean, and there are a lot of people with interests and our stakeholders in our documentation. Getting to them, getting their needs met, getting their interests met. That's let's just call it a interesting process. Specifically, we have to make sure our security requirements are met. We need to make sure our management is comfortable with it. We need to make sure that our legal department knows what we're doing for licensing. And yes, we did end up with an excellent open source license, the BSD. I believe it's a simplified license.
Yeah.
But getting that all together was a interesting process. But the important thing for me is that everybody wanted me to succeed, and that was great.
When we look at this contributions, I can see contributions coming across a lot of different ways. How do you make sure that your contributions are extending the value and the clarity of Nginx documentation? So if someone comes in there and they, you know, not necessarily copyrights or trademarks, BSD doesn't necessarily cover that. But somebody comes in and goes, "Oh, but I think it should be done this way. Therefore, I'm going to push a PR that either adds or changes content." How do you make sure the change suggestions are valid and worthwhile?
We work through what they want to do. If they're putting in a change, we test out what they want to change. For example, if there's a step-by-step procedure, we make sure that the steps that are being proposed actually work, number one. Number two, have some sort of readability. And there are actually programmatic ways to test readability. There are measures such as Flesch Kincaid, which measures the grade level readability of a lot of documentation. When you look at documentation out there in software, a lot of that stuff just blows people's minds. In other words, they're geared towards somebody at a graduate level. Yes, a lot of people using NGINX have that kind of education, but you don't want to stress them in that way. If you can have documentation that doesn't stress them, it makes it easier for them to actually use the product.
So I went out and took a look at the repo, which by the way is github.com/nginx, NGINX /documentation for the viewers here. And it's got a great README and it's got all these different things here. But where does somebody actually get started? What's the purpose of this versus the documentation itself?
You read documentation, you think, okay, I can do this better. I can find a typo and fix it. I can make things more readable. I see you all missed a step. It requires some pre-knowledge.
Mhm.
Number one, being able to install NGINX, which requires some knowledge of Linux, or BSD, which is something that a lot of our users already have. It also requires some knowledge of GitHub. You'll need a GitHub account to access our repository just stated, and also to get to our discussions, issues, and pull requests. But if you have that knowledge, which a lot of people have, you can open up issues and propose changes.
Yeah, so I think you just answered one of the questions I wanted to ask, but I'm going to just make sure. So a lot of our open source projects are using GitHub discussions for the back and forth, the actual deciding of what goes, what doesn't go, is what we need to work on. Is the documentation project also going to use GitHub issues? And how do you see that? How do you see keeping that alive and vigorous?
It'll use GitHub issues. It'll use GitHub discussions. There will be discussions in something known as pull requests, which in short are proposed changes.
Hmm.
And with any sort of open source community, we have a code of conduct. The code of conduct is right there in code _of _conduct.md in the repository. You can read it for yourself. Short version of it, be civil to each other. And if people do that, we can all get together to help NGINX documentation be better for the users.
Cool. So what does a user need to build to be able to work in this environment? It's got to be. In the previous version, we heard about Hugo. So, what do they need to install to be able to work with our documentation that way?
The lists are all there in the various README files in the repository, but yes, the instructions within the repository tell you how to install Hugo, what you can do when you install Hugo. We have pre-built commands that use Hugo and the source code of the repository to build our documentation in the way it appears currently at docs.nginx.com.
What's the easiest way for somebody to get started? Where's quite often projects have first issue type fix things, so forth. How does someone get started?
If you have access to our GitHub repository, look under issues. It'll have a number of issues labeled good first issue. Take a look at those. That'll tell you, hey, these people need help, and this is where me as a beginner can contribute.
Very cool. Okay, so I know I asked you this question in part one, but we always ask these questions, and so I'm going to phrase it slightly differently a little bit. What's your favorite personal open source project?
Personal open source project, that is phrased slightly differently. I still have to go back to the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, because of the way they communicate with each other. Not only are they security engineers who are actually open about security issues, but they're also really helpful, even for security newbies. I've contributed to their project, and it was a wonderful experience. In a similar fashion, the Kubernetes project is an excellent place if you want to contribute, even just from a documentation point of view. Their documentation is as rich and fully featured as any enterprise. It's an amazing thing to watch.
Very cool. So, any final thoughts that you want to share? What would you like to see people do going out and checking your repository?
Well, I mean, let me say something personal. As a Red Hat certified engineer and as somebody who's relied on the community, this feels like my chance to give back, to say, okay, here's something that's open. We've open sourced this. We could use your help. But on the other end, here's what we'll give to you. Not only a chance to contribute, but a chance to build your portfolio and make our NGINX documentation more easily readable and usable by the community.
Yeah. And given that NGINX open source core is one of the most widely used projects in the world, there should be a lot of people who would like to add that capability to their portfolio of accomplishments. And with that, Mike, thank you so much for coming on this NGINX community chat and getting into the bits and bytes of the open source documentation program here at NGINX. If you missed this, we did do a part one, which was more of an overview viewpoint about the why and how it's done for this. We've gotten in deeper into the how. And if you've got comments, feedbacks, feel free to add them below this. And as always, may the open source be with you.
Fantastic.